Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to be with us. We have a tremendous turnout and we're thrilled to have you with us here today. My name is Marcus Grimm. I'm a marketing strategist here at Ascendle. I'll be your moderator for today's panel discussion, AWS versus Microsoft Azure. Is there a winner in cloud hosting supremacy? Today, I'm joined by Bill Fistori, who is co-founder and CEO of Pantech, as well as Dave Todaro, CEO of Ascendle, as our panelists. Before we begin the presentation, I want to remind everyone we will be running a Q&A towards the end of the webinar. Please, we've assembled this Q&A feature in such a way that we want you to provide us with lots of great questions that we can provide feedback to you on. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Zoom platform and how to use it. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation. You can also click on the like button to upvote your favorite questions as well, and we encourage you to do that too. And of course, if you miss anything on today's presentation, don't worry. We will email you a link to this webinar's recording along with the slide deck after the show. So we're really looking forward to this one. Let's get started with some introductions. One of our panelist discussions today is our good friend, Bill Fistori. Now, Bill is the co-founder and CEO of Pantech. So Pantech, a little bit about them. They've been maintaining and servicing open source and cloud environments for over 25 years. The Pantech process identifies potential points of failure, reduces long-term costs, and improves uptime performance, something that obviously all of us are very concerned about. Pantech's client list, take a look at them. A lot of prominent companies and a lot of industry leaders there as well. Hopefully, Bill's providing free pizza for all of us today on the call. I'm not going to put him on the spot with that one. Our second panelist is Dave Todaro. Dave is the founder and CEO of Ascendle. For the last 35 years, Dave has been a technology leader involved in all aspects of product vision, software engineering, and of course, entrepreneurship. Let me take just a moment to introduce you to Ascendle if you're not familiar with us. For those of you who don't know, Ascendle is a leader in custom software development. We partner with companies as their full service development team to create mobile and web applications to drive their personal goals. And we also offer web, app, and platform development along with product strategy and product design. Speaking of those logos and clients here, just a few of Ascendle's clients. As you can see, we work with a wide variety of clients from early stage startups all the way to some of the largest enterprise organizations in the world. And it's also true that here at Ascendle, we wrote the book, or I should say Dave wrote the book. Dave spent 2 years to capture everything we know about Agile development, and in 2019 published the 500-page Epic Guide to Agile. Fantastic reading. Let's take a look at some of the topics we'll be addressing in today's panel discussion. Now, clearly we're talking about AWS and Azure, so yes, at some point we're going to find ourselves in those technical weeds a little bit. But what we're really going to try to do is focus on some of those key decision points, those business drivers that will really help you inform your decision as to whether or not AWS or Azure, if one of them could be a potential better solution for you or not. One of the decisions that we made early on in the planning of this webinar was to focus entirely on AWS and Microsoft Azure. Regardless of what report you read, together, these two are in fact the two 800-pound gorillas in the room. Now, if you're an international company, obviously you might have some experience with Alibaba or perhaps not. And if you're a big Google fan, you've probably heard about their cloud as well. Still, when we take a look at market share and how it goes across to the different companies, one of the things that we're actually seeing is the idea that when you look again at Microsoft and Azure, together, these two companies are in fact more than half of all of the cloud hosting revenue in the space. It's not to say that there aren't other companies that are doing some interesting things, but the reality is that by focusing on Azure and AWS, well, you likely have your bases covered. And in fact, not only do you have your bases covered, but you're also in the correct webinar. As for the next time today, these are the two platforms we are absolutely going to be talking about. So please keep those questions coming in as we move forward to our first panelist discussion, which in fact we are calling pricing. Now, as mentioned, we're going to be going over a lot of comparisons between the two platforms. But if you're responsible for budgeting, and I suspect several people on this webinar are, you probably have had the question, well, is Microsoft Azure cheaper? Is AWS a better investment for me? In fact, if you were to Google AWS versus Azure pricing comparisons, what you discover is there's actually more than 5 million different results in Google to this particular question. So my first question is for Dave Todaro. Dave, there are so many variables when it comes to cloud hosting pricing. What are the odds that any of those 5 million price comparisons on Google are correct?
Yeah, great question. And first, before I dig in there, thank you everyone for taking your time today. I'm sure everyone is very busy with their schedule. And so we appreciate you taking some time out of your day. So on the pricing side, look, it's really a bit of a cold war out there as far as these two platforms go. If you're doing some sort of pilot project and you're spending $150 a month to spin up a couple of services, yeah, you might look and compare these two and realize that, all right, well, this one's going to cost me 125 bucks. This other one's going to cost me $143. That, at that scale, maybe you'll see some differences. When you get up into the larger deployments where you're spending thousands of dollars a month, it probably isn't going to be a big deal if you're spending $10,000 a month on one platform versus $10,200 a month on another platform. And when you're working with these platforms, these vendors at scale, they're going to work with you. They're certainly not going to lose a big deal because you're going to be picking one versus another. The more important thing to look at is your all-in cost. And that we'll get into a little bit more toward the end, where we say, well, all right, which one of these should I pick? But what's going to eclipse the cost of the services is your personnel costs, the human cost. So based on what challenge you're tackling, it might make sense to go in terms of, or in one direction versus another. And it's usually around your existing investment. So for example, if I have a team that's very familiar with Azure and we built a bunch of stuff on Azure, it probably doesn't make sense to all of a sudden say, well, I can save $200 a month on my $10,000 bill, and I should switch over to Azure, because the human cost you're going to pay is just going to be huge. If you're on neither of these platforms, but your team does have experience with technologies that are a better fit, and I think Bill will talk a little bit more about that, then again, there, it's going to be faster to develop your product, and therefore picking that platform that's going to let you accelerate as quickly as possible. That's really where the cost difference comes into play, not really the cost of the services themselves.
It's a great point, Dave, and thank you for sharing that. Bill, I heard you make a statement before that when you think about pricing and the cloud platforms, doing a head-to-head comparison is really tricky, and it even caused you to respond that, well, in some ways you believe the cloud pricing war might be over. And what do you mean by that, Bill?
Yeah, let me clarify that a bit. If you go back, we'll say 10 years when Amazon first came out as a public cloud, most companies that we managed were in private clouds or hosting facilities, and they were competing with each other on pricing. When Amazon came out, most clients were moving workloads or data primarily to lower costs, and to use that technology as an advantage to lower their private cloud hosting costs. As time went on, a couple things happened. One is Azure came out, so another public cloud, since we're talking about Microsoft as well. But a lot of the private hosting providers now had to adjust their pricing downward to compete with the public cloud pricing. So just to move to do a lift and shift from a private cloud to a public cloud like Amazon, a lot of times is not a driving factor to do so. And as far as when you're comparing AWS and Azure, they both know each other's pricing models. They're both very competitive. They're both driving for market share. I kind of relate it to looking at Cisco routers versus Juniper routers. Not a big difference technology-wise. There's branding, pricing's very similar. They both have special pricings for different initiatives. So if you're looking at a machine learning project, sometimes Amazon will have a program around that to provide either service dollars or monthly credits to win that business. So clients should look at that whenever they're making a decision.
Awesome. It's a great feedback, Bill. Thank you. Going to move on to our next topic now. I want to talk a little bit about open source. And we've already alluded to the fact that when it comes to cloud hosting, and Dave mentioned this in our last discussion, we all bring some biases to the table. We bring biases to the table, platforms that we've worked on previously, platforms that maybe we didn't have a great experience with previously. Things that at one point in time were certainly true, and they might still be true, but then again, they might not be. And so one of the ones we want to talk about, where it seems like opinions have shifted over the years, is open source. So Bill, I'm going to go back to you with this one. I want to move on to open source and how well each of these platforms embraces the open source community. Bill, what's your experience been with AWS and open source?
Yeah, I would say the short answer is it's kind of a cultural decision right now. That's one area. With open source engineers tend to lean towards working in AWS. You know, in the past, AWS has touted more tools and service for the open source community. However, those trends are changing. Azure, Microsoft and Azure are being much more competitive in that space right now. I mean, I have a quick statistic that I wrote down. It was more than 50% of the VM cores run Linux on Azure today.
So Dave, it certainly makes sense that a company like Microsoft over the years, they've been bashed at being open source at one point in time. Times change. Do you think that anti-open source sentiment against Microsoft, does that criticism still hold up today?
It really doesn't. 10, 15 years ago, if you said Microsoft and open source in the same sentence, you'd kind of scratch your head and say, what are you talking about? Isn't open source a four-letter word to Microsoft? Isn't their whole company based on proprietary technology? And, back then it was true. And I think in the early days of Azure, you could take a look at that platform and say, well, it's pretty much all the Microsoft stuff just moved into the cloud. So there's really no open source thing. But times have really changed. So Microsoft.NET, the development platform that Microsoft has, is all open source now with .NET Core. It's 100% open source. In fact, if you go on GitHub, you can contribute to .NET, which again, 15 years ago, that would be a bit of a head scratcher. There's over 60,000 contributors to the .NET Core platform, and it's being improved all the time. So that's on the programming side. On the platform side, in terms of cloud services, there's full support today for, as Bill pointed out, Linux, not only in terms of Linux virtual machines, but a lot of the services that are run are now using open source technology. When you get into microservices, for example, running Docker and Kubernetes, full support for that. That's really come into its own on Azure in the past 2 or 3 years. We worked on one project where we were kind of right at the inception of some of those things and or some of those features and functions that were a little bit missing. And Microsoft has now backfilled that. And so they're really on an even par. I think to Bill's point, what you'll find is that the community, the open source community, if they're not adopting any sort of Microsoft technologies, are going to lean toward AWS. If you're working with any Microsoft technologies, particularly if you're a Microsoft shop, you're an enterprise company with a big Microsoft footprint, it might be a little bit of an easier fit on Azure. But the good news is that you don't have to pick, right? You don't have to say, well, Azure is a better fit for us, but we can't do this open source stuff. So now we also have to go over here to AWS. Has really full support in the key technologies. Like anything, there's going to be differences with each of the platforms.
Right. Bill, anything to add to that before we move on to the next topic? That one, I find that one to be particularly interesting because I do think that it's one of those topics that 10 years ago, our panelists might have been more at odds than they are at this point today. But at this point, open source doesn't seem to be a clear differentiator, except to Dave's point in how big that community is on AWS. Anything to add, Bill, before we move on?
No, I'm a bit biased, or our company was built on the foundation of open source Linux, and so our engineers are as well. Although we would never tell a client not to go to Azure. We have partners that do Azure. So um, I think that this day and age, uh, with Azure in the space, building on open source uh, tools, it now gives customers more options to make a better decision.
Awesome. Terrific. So let's move on now a little bit I want to talk about compliance. And compliance is, I remember when clouds started coming to the forefront in the past several years. And if we turn back the clock about a decade, there were so many companies that were hesitant to move data to the cloud. And a lot of those reasons came down to security and compliance. Suddenly, not knowing exactly where that sensitive data was and how it was protected, it was a very, very big deal. Perhaps not surprisingly, both AWS and Azure have since invested massively in compliance, and that makes sense, given that compliance tends to be an issue faced by the large enterprise organizations with very, very large budgets. So Dave, I want to go to you on this one. Now, both AWS and Azure have had a lot to say about compliance through the years, but I've heard you say it's one of those areas where we really need to ask if what we're seeing from each other is distinction or difference. Can you elaborate how you think to advise clients as it relates to compliance?
Yeah, and this is another good news for us as software developers, because these companies are investing all of these tens of billions of dollars in their framework and infrastructure. They provide these features and functions for us where we don't have to hand code them. So again, going back years ago, you would kind of have to roll your own compliance related functionality. A real simple example is with healthcare and HIPAA. So we did a healthcare application a couple of years ago, and we looked at the standards as far as encryption and security and whatnot. Some of those standards affected how we designed the application, but other standards were really technical. So for example, they talk about data at rest. A real simple way to say, if you're storing data somewhere, it needs to be encrypted. This specific type of data needs to be encrypted. Well, we looked at coding our own solution to that. And then as we were working on that project now a few years ago, Azure came out with functionality that we essentially checked a box, and they implemented that security feature for us, which was specifically designed to cover this HIPAA requirement, as well as other requirement or other compliance rules related to that data at rest. That's just one small example. So that's really the good news. The bad news is that you can still screw it up, right? If you have a development team that doesn't really know what they're doing, it's not, if you've got a piece of equipment, you still need to be able to use that piece of equipment. So again, it comes back to the human factor. But at least in the Azure world, the good news there is there's huge companies using the platform. So Microsoft has been forced to implement these different technology solutions to satisfy their compliance needs. So usually the companies that we're dealing with, which are, in some cases the largest of the largest, but in many cases it's smaller companies, we can take advantage of all that work that they've done. And again, those tens of billions of dollars, but we still need to leverage those developers to understand, all right, how do we leverage those tools and satisfy these compliance requirements?
Right. Right. Now, Bill, we made a conscious decision in this particular webinar that we were going to focus entirely on AWS and Azure. However, it would seem to me that compliance is probably one of those areas that requires a ton of investment. And so from my perspective, some of those smaller niche cloud providers, do you think they're going to be able to close the gap as it relates to AWS and Azure in compliance? Or is this an area where AWS and Azure are going to maintain, in your opinion, a strong lead over the smaller players?
Yeah, I think it's no longer a nice to have. Uh, it's a it's a need to have in this space, to compete in this space. And for example, if you're looking to take on clients that do business internationally, out of the box, you have to essentially comply to GDPR standards. All hosting cloud providers have to. I don't see a way around that. AWS has a nice model. It's a shared security model, um, as does Azure, but it basically outlines what they provide out of the box for compliance. Um, on the back end, perimeter security, server security, OS security, anything along those lines. And then it outlines what your responsibility as the end user client is from end user security, monitoring, things of that ilk. So I think in order to be competitive, um, those things are going to either are or smaller public cloud providers will need to provide that.
That's well said. Well said. Let's move on to something, and now here becomes another area where it will be a great discussion, because I feel like how things were a few years ago is not necessarily how they are today. We've said this before, it's really difficult to keep up with all the changes going on in this space. The risk then is that if you have a negative bias on a specific platform, which might no longer be relevant, you might not be bringing the most current knowledge to your team. This brings us to an area where we've seen AWS truly changing both their offering and their story. And what we're going to be talking about now is, in fact, the hybrid cloud. And we're going to go right back to Bill in this one. Bill, it wasn't that long ago that we have a quote here from AWS where they referred to, quote, pure public cloud or nothing. And yet just last month, AWS releases Snowball Edge, which is a 100 terabyte hard drive for moving workloads between its cloud and client data centers. Bill, it's hard not to see that and think that maybe AWS is changing their story and are embracing the hybrid cloud more. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a must, and that's the industry trend. Everyone's going to expect and deploy different applications in different with different cloud providers. I would say, one of the things Microsoft has had the edge there because they could deploy to private servers and private data centers where AWS wouldn't allow that, but that is changing now. So and then there's I guess when you say hybrid cloud, there's different definitions to different people. So I'll give you an example. We deal with a lot of small to medium tech companies. One of our clients, they're doing all their back office work with Office 365, so email, Office, Excel. They have a CRM, say it's a SaaS product like a Salesforce or a Zoho, and that's provided by those companies. But then they have I'll call it a business critical or revenue producing application that's running in AWS that we help deploy and support. And to me, I think that's more of a hybrid cloud. That's what I'm seeing more prevalent in my world.
Yep. Great feedback. Dave, question for you. We talked about open source and probably in the olden days, a handful of years ago, AWS was thought of more favorably as it relates to open source. But when we talk about hybrid cloud capabilities, Azure has had a great reputation over the years. And why is that? How have they developed that great reputation for the hybrid cloud?
Well, if you think about it, you can look at the background of these two vendors, right? So one was selling books, and then the other one was in enterprises, right? So, and in enterprises before, Amazon was a glint in Jeff Bezos's eyes. So you can't help but be able to leverage that long history of enterprise penetration by Microsoft. So Microsoft is still heavily leveraged in data centers in particularly larger companies all over the world. So it's sort of a natural fit that, well, if our customers are going to now start adopting this new back when Azure was introduced cloud platform, we should probably make it pretty easy for them to mix and match between their data centers and the cloud. So they kind of had a natural leg up really out of necessity because they couldn't go to their customers. I'm sure they tried and said, all right, why don't you guys just move everything to the cloud and, start paying us a lot more money than you have, from your traditional licensing. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. And so they've made a huge investment, and it has like everything with both these cloud vendors, it has evolved over time. That that project I mentioned earlier, in fact, they had a requirement in terms of secure networking between on-premise data centers and Azure, and it wasn't quite there yet. It was specific to their microservices architecture, and Microsoft was just rolling out this new feature. In fact, our client was a pilot customer for that new functionality. So I think, Microsoft had a little bit of an unfair advantage because they kind of started in the data center. But to Bill's point, sometimes when you talk about hybrid cloud, there's another variable, which is mixing multiple clouds plus your on-premise solution. And so you can look at a little bit of a best of both worlds. Again, there may be some workloads where AWS makes more sense and maybe doesn't have that requirement for as strong a tie-in with your existing on-premise or data center based Microsoft technology.
Yep. Wonderful. Great
Yeah, and
feedback.
I think
Go ahead, Bill.
one other point or thing to consider, Dave, we debated this because there's different ways to look at it, but if you're building, say, a particular application for a cloud deployment in AWS, is look at more non-proprietary cloud tools to deploy and support that application. However, that could lead to some, I guess you could limit some of your functionality. I know you had mentioned that as well, but it's a way to look at, hey, if you're looking to port an application, you're concerned, you can use some cloud neutral tools like Kubernetes, Docker, Circle CI, all in those tool sets where portability may be a little easier than just using all the AWS or all the Azure tools.
Terrific. Thank you. As we move on to the next topic, I would encourage everyone, please use that Q&A panel there. Plenty of questions are coming in, and we're going to hopefully get to all of them on today's program. So please keep those questions coming in. Hey, if you don't think there's been a lot of conversation around container services, well, sorry, you haven't been paying attention. In fact, just in 2019, Gartner estimated that containerized applications were running in 20% of companies, but they predicted that that percentage would balloon to 70% by the year 2023, which is almost insurmountable just in terms of thinking how much growth that is. Bill, obviously AWS has been paying attention to what's been happening with container services. There was one blogger who was covering AWS's reInvent just last month in December, and he said day one was, quote, all about containers. What do organizations like about the AWS platform as it relates directly to container services?
Yeah, I look at this a little more generically, where I would say this could be a little controversial, but I would say, containerization and serverless computing is gaining momentum, as you see with the Gartner statistics and the other statistics out there. I look at it as, I think it's going to be in the near future, the prevalent way application developers, DevOps personnel are going to be delivering applications, almost like the way VMware became the de facto standard in virtualization, where they took over the OS virtual servers, and that became the standard. When they first came out, people just used that for test and dev. If you remember back in the day, until they got confidence in VMware solution, and then it became just the standard and way to roll out servers and operating systems in the enterprise.
It's a great answer. So Dave, Bill says containers are going to be a huge trend. AWS says containers are going to be a huge trend. Kind of hard to believe that Microsoft won't be embracing container services with the same fervor. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And in fact, they've made huge investments in containers, particularly those technologies Bill had mentioned, Docker and Kubernetes. Like AWS has done, Microsoft has created their own layer on top of Kubernetes, their own sort of a management console called AKS. And that makes it simply easier. But the underlying technologies are in fact identical. And those are the market leading technologies, both open source, both available on AWS and Azure. Both AWS and Azure have their own flavor of management tools to manage that. But at the end of the day, Docker and Kubernetes is where it's at. I'll take this opportunity to get on my soapbox. You know, when you have a shiny new hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that can be a danger. Pretty much you'll probably be able to tell the entire theme of my approach to looking at selecting technology, selecting cloud platforms is all about speed and quality and, you know, the ability to maintain the application and scale. And scaling is certainly where microservices is unbeatable compared to anything else. We've been able to do scaling in different ways over time, but microservices just makes it a heck of a lot easier to do it. But you know, with great power comes great responsibility. So you need to be careful about what you're doing. And you know, we have seen some clients in the past get into a little bit of trouble because they're trying to jump a little bit too heavily into the microservices in candidly applications that didn't quite need it or didn't need microservices for all of it because they didn't face those scaling requirements quite yet. It was a brand new product, wasn't being used by anybody, wasn't anticipated to be all of a sudden used by 10,000 or 100,000 or a million users. So they didn't really need the power of microservices, and probably development would have gone faster if they started, you know, took a little bit of a crawl, walk, run sort of approach. The most important thing when diving into particularly a new development effort is making sure that your technology is supportable via microservices. Because you know, with microservices, there's really two pieces. One is the architecture being microservices friendly, and then there's the deployment into the actual microservices. And when we say microservices, for those of you who might not be totally familiar, you can think about it as a bunch of small servers that are really easy to spin up and tear down and can automatically be kind of, as they say, orchestrated, increased in terms of capacity. And this is an oversimplification. And then you can take components of your software and you can deploy it in different ways. And then if one piece of your software needs a lot more scalability, you can ramp that up and only pay for that much capability for that piece of the software, where the rest of your software is still using the less expensive services because that's only what's needed over here. And so the most important thing is making sure that you're not painting yourself into a corner. So when you're developing your new platform or new application, if you are working with a development team or a third-party company, always ask, now, can this be deployed in a microservices environment? And the answer should be yes. And then the other question might be, when do we need to deploy to a microservices environment? And that answer can vary. It could be, well, from day one, that just makes sense. Or it could be, you know, when you hit this threshold of volume, or let's test it a little bit out in the wild and see which aspects of the application might need some more resources and can take advantage of the microservices. And I should clarify, microservices is still a little bit of a hand-wavy term. In some cases, it could mean what I've been talking about, Docker and Kubernetes, you know, in these containers. But the other way to think about microservices is leveraging a bunch of different services on these platforms. And that could, in fact, be a different answer. So, for example, do I want to write code in my solution to be able to do some processing of images and turning them into thumbnails? Well, that might not be very efficient. And in fact, the cloud providers have the ability to create very small, what they call serverless technology, which will go off and do that. Once you add that into the mix, you're essentially doing microservices. So it's a little bit of an overloaded term. But the key takeaway is absolutely both these platforms support microservices and containerization. And really, it's really just been in the past 2 or 3 years that I think the platforms have come into their own. I think Azure was probably a little bit behind on the AWS world because all this technology is open source, but they've certainly more than caught up.
great, well, ton of great feedback there. I appreciate that. Very,
And I
very
think,
useful. You said something interesting, Dave, which was, concerns about painting yourself into a corner, which just segues terrifically into this slide, which it's great because we actually had a question come in about this. And the question was related to vendor portability and what happens if I need or want to leave a cloud hosting provider. In a perfect world, obviously you would choose Azure or AWS, and that's the end of it. But as we know, there are reasons sometimes companies can and do switch providers, assuming, of course, that in fact they can. Dave, you've been a CTO, so you've been the one thinking about how wedded you are, whether that be to a given platform or a given technology. How would you advise other people to think about AWS and Microsoft just in the context of vendor portability?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a little bit of a thorny question. Um, you can tie yourself up in knots worrying about, well, what happens if Microsoft is gonna bend us over the barrel all of a sudden and triple their prices, and what happens if we're stuck with them. But you need to balance that against what I talked about earlier, and again, this is the recurring theme: productivity of your developers. It's actually going to be a lot harder to avoid any sort of vendor lock-in than it is to just say, you know what, we're going to pick a direction, and that direction might be different depending on what platform or application we're building. And in fact, many companies, most, I would say larger companies, actually use multiple platforms. However, when it comes to one specific application or one specific platform that you're building in one of these cloud vendors, you're just simply going to go faster if you leverage all the stuff that they've built. Right? Remember, these guys, AWS and Microsoft, they're spending tens of billions of dollars developing all of this stuff. And if you say, you know what, I don't want to use any of that, well, you're not going to be able to leverage that huge investment that they've made. So at the end of the day, if I, for example, use the Azure flavor of their Kubernetes control panel to manage all of my stuff, and all of a sudden I decide to abandon Azure and switch to AWS, which as a CTO, I'd want a really, really good reason to do that because that's going to be pretty expensive for me. I might have to reconfigure some stuff in the new AWS dashboard. But again, the underlying technology is supported across those platforms. So the good news is it is a little bit of the best of both worlds. I can take advantage of the vendor specific stuff, but underneath the covers, in most cases, they're based on the same underlying and open source technology. And so if I have a relational database in Azure, I'm going to be able to move that to the similar relational database in AWS. I'm going to need to reconfigure it because now I'm going to be tying into the AWS flavor that gives me access to my SQL Server database or a Postgres database or whatever it might be, or MongoDB or whatnot. Right. So again, I would look at the big picture of what's going to get me done the fastest and leverage the heck out of what services these platforms provide. And only have in the back of my head, if there is a choice that I can make that's not going to impact the throughput of my team, and it does give me a little bit more portability, then sure, if it doesn't cost me anything. But I think you can tie yourself up in knots worrying about something that honestly, I don't think is going to be a problem. Unless AWS goes away or Azure goes away, meaning that there's no competitive pressure, I think they're going to keep each other in check. You're not all of a sudden, going to have your prices triple.
So Bill, when we talk about cloud hosting, I kind of get the sense that one of the really simple analogies that I've been thinking of is office furniture. And generally speaking, if a large enterprise organization picks Herman Miller or Steelcase, they're probably going to stay with it unless there is a compelling reason to swap out everything. Bill, do you think as we move forward, we will see more companies switching between the major cloud providers, or for all the reasons Dave said, do you think that that concern's a little bit overblown?
Yeah, short answer is no. One of the main reasons, it's costly. It's logistically a pain in the ass, and it if you're looking at the ROI, it typically is not really worth it unless you have, um, if you're having considerable outages or service issues, it's usually not because of the technology stack. So taking it from my experience, where we deal with a lot more small to mid-sized companies, startups, tech companies, companies rolling out, maybe building or rolling out a new application for the cloud. Um, I think it, I think one of the more important pieces of that is, if you're outsourcing, is to vet your service provider, because you're more likely to switch service providers than you are cloud providers.
That is very well said. Spot on comment there. Thank you. Want to remind everyone, please keep your questions coming in. We're down to our final two topics, and then we'll be at the Q&A portion of our program. Fans of Ascendle know that Dave wrote the book on Agile, literally. As such, it wouldn't be fair not to bring in a question related to which provider, AWS or Azure, is simpler for those Agile companies that wish to be deploying on a rapid basis and releases often and quickly. Those familiar with Agile know that the mandate is, in fact, to ship early and ship often. It's a different approach than your standard waterfall releases. So, Bill, I'll go to you first, and then we'll bounce this one to Dave. How is AWS for companies that like to work in Agile, or others that are just doing these rapid ongoing releases?
Yeah, most of the stuff we do is in AWS, and most of our clients we deal with are following either um, the Agile process, because we're working hand in hand with app developers all the time. I would say so. I think to me it's pretty vanilla between Azure and AWS. Again, it comes down to your resources, skill sets internally, or your outsourced resources. Um, but I would say, if it's just a vanilla lift and shift, we don't really see it. And where we're doing, either working with partners like Ascendle, doing refactoring applications, building an application for the cloud, uh, we're just seeing that the most prevalent way to deploy and manage applications um, in the public cloud environment. And that's primarily to get the efficiencies of releases, updates, um, new product features, and then managing and supporting that. It goes around the whole DevOps concept and culture of working hand in hand, your teams working hand in hand. I mean, that's expanded now to DevSecOps, incorporating security into that. But between the two between Azure and AWS, I don't really see any. I would say I haven't seen or heard of any benefit between the two, deploying your application in either environment.
And Dave, your team does a ton of work in Azure, but we also know that I'm probably not misspeaking when I say you do all of your work in Agile. So what's your experience been? I'm going to guess it's been positive, but please tell us a story or two.
Yeah, most of our work has ended up in Azure simply because our clients were either already in Azure or they didn't have a preference, and a lot of the work we do is Microsoft. Probably about 70% of the work we do is in Azure and about 30% in AWS. And we've seen on both platforms, again, that's a distinction without a difference, different names for different services, but at the end of the day, you can do really the two critical pieces that we need to accomplish, which is continuous integration, which is running all of the automated unit tests anytime a line of code changes and is committed into the centralized repository, and continuous deployment, which is being able to take that code, compile it, and deploy it into a test environment or a demo environment or production staging, release, etc. So what we have seen is, if you are a Microsoft shop, again, you're likely using Microsoft tooling for your development, and it just plays easier with Azure. So if you stay in the family, it's just going to play a little bit easier. Again, we've had no problems on those projects where we have used AWS and with Microsoft tooling or open source technologies, it's all just worked. Again, just a little bit less friction and therefore a little bit faster, less cost for our clients by staying in the family. So again, that's the, sort of if you're already in the Microsoft family, if you're already a Microsoft shop, there's probably going to be less friction on the DevOps side to stick with the Azure side of things.
Minimizing friction is key in business in all things. Now, before we get to our Q&A, we do want to pause for a moment here. Look, as you've no doubt noticed over the past several minutes, we've learned that both platforms are extremely powerful, and we've learned that doing a side-by-side comparison between them is in fact quite difficult. Part of the reason for this is that both platforms are constantly innovating, but the other key reason is because your choice in platform is likely going to be driven heavily by some of the context that takes place within your own four walls. Dave, you've been a CTO. What are some of the questions that CTOs need to be asking about their own organizations that might inform them in their choice in a cloud provider?
Yeah, again, it really boils down to one concept, and that's friction. How much friction is there going to be with going with Azure? How much friction is there going to be going to AWS? And that friction may come from a couple of different sources. First of all, looking at your people. Are developers primarily doing Microsoft development on the back end, regardless of the front end? Typically these days, it's all open source stuff on the front end, regardless of what the back end is. Or are we doing a bunch of Node.js stuff in the back end or Java stuff in the back end? Depending on what technology we're using, it might be a better flavor. Microsoft backend, probably Azure's an easier fit. Java, Node.js backend primarily, AWS is likely going to be a better fit. And then looking at, well, what workloads do we already have in the cloud? Do we have all of our stuff in Azure already? And again, are we going to save $200 a month by moving to AWS? And as Bill said, it's a huge pain. And anything that's a huge pain immediately turns into dollar signs. And not only dollar signs in terms of the work that you're doing, but the opportunity cost of all the time you're spending moving cloud providers, which could otherwise be spent developing new stuff and getting further ahead of the competition. And then the other area of friction could be, let's say we're acquiring a company and all their stuff is in AWS, but we're in Azure. Well, should we move all their stuff from AWS to Azure? Probably not, right? We should just figure out how to coexist because again, it's that friction. So that's what I would look at. I would think about what is going to reduce the amount of friction.
Not too surprisingly, the guy who's always talking about shipping faster and shipping speedy and shipping quality is looking to reduce friction. Bill, what's some of the advice that you like to give to companies if they're trying to make this decision? What do you think they should be looking at? I think you're muted, sir.
Sorry about that. Yeah, in our world, we see a lot of what we tell our clients is they should be reviewing their overall business strategy and how technology ties to that. In the real world, what we see is a lot of times the application or the application developers drive the decision. So a lot of times we're seeing, if we're dealing with a startup, they're usually coming to us and saying, oh yeah, we already spun up some instances, we built a minimal viable product, and it's running in AWS. And then they say, can you help us deploy it? And in those instances, we're often running and we're working with them hand in hand. I think a lot has to do with company culture. So, and expertise. So if you're a large enterprise and you're all Microsoft, you have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, all your engineers are trained in Microsoft, I wouldn't really see a reason why to change everything and go with AWS, because usually the engineers are driving those decisions anyway. And if you just, it would take a lot of investment time, excuse me, time and effort to train those same engineers on the AWS platform. So, and then the other things you have to look at is, are you going to outsource or insource this? And if so, do you already have partners lined up? Who's in your ecosystem? Who do you trust? Things of that ilk.
Terrific. That is tremendous feedback. which brings us to our final slide for the day, which is our Q&A slide. We have several questions here that we'll be working our way through. Please keep those questions coming in. I'll be feeding the questions to our panelists. I will tell you that in some cases, if we don't have an answer for you today, we will say that is a phenomenal question and we will reach out to you and answer it directly. In particular, because your moderator has less technical experience than either of these two very well-spoken men on the phone here. So if I butcher any questions, that is all entirely on me, but please keep those questions coming in. The first question, and I'm going to put this one out there, and for the first one, I'm going to try to hand it to Dave, and Dave, you can feel free to pass it to Bill if need be. Question number one is, when it comes to deployment of MS SQL Server in cloud, is there any possibility that AWS or any other cloud service provider can beat Azure at all? Dave, will give you that one.
I'm actually gonna punt that one to Bill. What do you think, Bill? Can you beat Azure if it came down to SQL Server? That may not really be a fair question, because the first question I would ask is, well, what else is there besides SQL Server?
That you would need to do a bake-off, like a proof of concept, because there's other factors involved in answering that. So I really wouldn't know.
Okay. We will try to find out the answer for that one. Is it true it is difficult to leave AWS, so vendor portability? Is it true that it's difficult to leave AWS because they use a proprietary hypervisor?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay. In my experience, I haven't seen it, so I haven't seen that being an issue.
Okay. Dave, anything to add to that one?
No, and that's going to apply, I think, more to virtual machines, which the biggest bang for the buck you're going to get is leveraging individual services as opposed to virtual machines. So I guess my answer to that would be, you should probably take a hard look at, do we still need a virtual machine? Can we do some re-architecting for that? But as far as the hypervisor goes, I think it would depend on just how many virtual machines are you managing, because it's going to take some work if you were to move off of AWS onto another platform. But if it's a virtual machine, it's going to be running Windows or it's going to be running Linux, and you're going to need to spin it up and configure it. Can you pick it up and drop it on another cloud? That might be a little aggressive to be able to do that.
Okay, great. This next question, it's a two-parter. So we'll put Dave on the spot with this one. We have a customer that wants to span a single application across multiple clouds, AWS, Azure, GCP, as well as IBM and private clouds. They want to do this for two reasons. The first is fault tolerance of their public global solution. And second is proximity. The solution connects with enterprise stuff. So if the customer is all in on AWS, they want to connect to AWS nodes. But if the customer is all in somewhere else, they will want to connect to that. So if the application itself needs to span all these platforms, the stack needs to be rather portable, not using idiosyncratic features only on AWS, etc. Any recommendations for the person who took the time to write this very detailed question?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So obviously, it sounds like you've already answered the first question I would have, which is, well, what's the business reason to introduce this additional friction? And you answered it right there. The customers want to talk to this. I guess I would wonder if all of the components of the application or the platform need to be replicated on all cloud platforms, because that is going to handcuff you a bit. You can absolutely do it, but it might be a little bit tough, depending on the nature of the application, to get everything done being totally vendor agnostic. There may be some pieces where, to do this, we need to do blob storage on Azure, and we need to do S3 storage on AWS, and the way we talk to those are a little bit different. So you may end up needing to, the way I would do it if I was faced with this is I would figure out what has to run on every platform, and can we actually have one centralized solution As far as fault tolerance goes, I mean, again, because these companies are spending tens of billions of dollars on these platforms, unless you've got a geography that isn't supported by one, I mean, they're going to be fault tolerance. You can have a geo-distributed sort of deployment, which is going to handle fault tolerance if, the entire Northeast goes down or something like that. And then what I would look at is building adapters. So I'd figure out how the core of my application would be able to be as similar as possible. So I can drop that core of the application. And then maybe I've got some edge stuff which has different adapters based on which cloud platform I'm on. So I want to maximize the common stuff and minimize the specialized stuff. And can be done. Again, it's going to introduce a whole heck of a lot of friction, and you're probably just going to need more DevOps planning and strategy, and just more DevOps personnel for the care and feeding of all those clouds. But certainly can be done. It's just going to cost you more in terms of your bodies, in terms of the developers and DevOps, and obviously it's going to cost more as far as the cloud services goes.
Great answer. I want to remind the attendees, please feel free to keep the Q&As coming in. Feel free to upvote the Q&As that are in there if you'd like to make sure they make it up to the top of the list. We do recognize we're getting up to the top of the hour. We're going to keep going with Q&A. People love the opportunity to ask Dave and Bill questions. We're going to make sure we take care of those questions today. Obviously, if you need to drop off, we certainly understand, but please keep those questions coming in. Bill, I love this next question because it's a philosophy question. There is no right or wrong. I just think it's a great question just in light of recent events. This is the person says, maybe this is an extreme case, but I would like to talk a little bit about AWS dropping Parler. Will this kind of cloud provider behavior influence future comparison decision on cloud service picking? It's a question. It's certainly not one of the things that we've talked about today. The person acknowledges switching providers is extremely expensive. Do you think that the types of what happened between AWS and Parler over the past couple of weeks could influence some future decisions?
Yeah, I would definitely say those types of changes would influence decisions. And if you're using particular services, it's always a good question to ask your cloud provider what their technology roadmap is, or understand what their technology roadmap is. What services are they adding, and what services are they getting rid of?
Outstanding. Outstanding. Dave, anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit of an edge case, because that was basically AWS saying that you violated our terms. You're always gonna have that problem when you have controversial applications. So that's just one thing to think about.
Terrific. Terrific. Question comes here, which I thought was really interesting, because both of you have talked about the fact that Dave, you do a lot of work in Azure, but you've also done a ton of work in AWS, and the reverse is true for Bill. And so this question is coming from a consultant who quite frankly wants to know, would you advise that consultant to be an AWS person or an Azure person? Or in today's environment, do you have to be able to walk the walk and talk the talk against all these providers? Bill, since you're not on mute, I'll let you answer this one first, but I'd love to get feedback from both of you on this one.
The short answer is it's hard with all the different services between the two cloud providers. It's hard to be an expert in both. I mean, I can just take my company, for example, we're a small business. I would love to do Azure services, but we focus on AWS because it's very costly to train and manage our engineers alone in AWS and make them experts. It'd be very difficult to take our engineers and our skill sets and just port them over and get them all trained on Azure. So it's very difficult to be an expert in both. Usually larger service providers have two divisions, one that's primarily delivering Azure solutions and one that's primarily delivering AWS. And there's always outliers. And there's some people that may be able to be an expert in AWS, and they do have some Azure skills. Did that answer question.
Yes, absolutely. Dave, your thoughts?
I think it depends. So there's a wide range of how much expertise is required. Um, there's super complex, super sophisticated cloud applications that need to handle huge scale, which is going to require a pretty big amount of expertise in the technology, not only the underlying technology, but the platform, the cloud vendor, and how their tooling works. And then there's straightforward applications. We're building an app for a startup. They expect, hopefully users in the thousands in the first 12 months. It's not a big heavy lift. We need to be able to deploy data storage, messaging, the application itself, configure, um, how to get to the application, et cetera, configure some security. That's going to be pretty basic and straightforward to do on different platforms. So our answer to that is, if it's sort of the scratching the surface level, then we would typically have senior software engineers and DevOps folks that can play in either of those ponds. And then for the deep stuff, we would actually go and find that expertise. So I think I'm agreeing with Bill that once you start getting down into the lower levels of detail and sort of a higher requirement and heavier lift, it's going to be really hard to have that level of expertise in both. What's that saying? An expert is someone who's made every possible mistake in a narrow field. It's difficult to find someone who's screwed up enough times in both Azure and AWS to be a true expert.
I appreciate you giving me a new definition for that, Dave. Thank you. Let's take a technical question. Can AWS host my Microsoft 365 offering as a SaaS? Dave,
Um, oh,
Bill's going with I don't know,
I don't know.
I'm gonna,
Dave,
yeah.
I would be, yeah, I'd be curious why, but why would you'd want to do that? But I've never heard of it, or I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're deploying an on-premise Microsoft server, you can spin up a virtual machine on AWS and deploy your Microsoft software onto that server. So if that's a hard requirement, then that's great. That's obviously going to be a self-hosted approach. If Office 365 is being consumed in the cloud, then you're leveraging Microsoft's servers, which are in fact hosted in Azure behind the scenes. So a little tough to answer that without more details. But again, if you're hosting any on-premise, Windows-backed server, you're going to be able to do it on AWS.
So the last question was about what you can do on AWS. Let's talk about Azure. Dave, can we migrate EC2 to Azure like VMware?
That honestly, I haven't hit. I would be surprised if Azure didn't have any tooling to help you with that. Again, there, it may not be just picking up the virtual hard drive and dropping it over into Azure, but it might be more of a Windows migration.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't faced that, to be honest. We don't actually work with virtual machines too often because we're leveraging all the various Microsoft services. So we try to avoid virtual machines as much as we can because, well, for two reasons. One, they're very expensive, and two, they require a lot of care and feeding. So we try to avoid those unless they're absolutely necessary.
Yep.
That's probably going to be more of a systems integrator type of question, dealing with lift and shift sort of stuff. Probably, I imagine some of Bill's engineers might know the answer to that question, but.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've got one more philosophy question here. With the growing popularity of cloud services, the way things are going, it would be possible to say that around 80 to 90% of the world's data would be sitting with either AWS, Microsoft, and Google. Are governments or organizations thinking about anything in this area? Are there discussions around the risk? I guess a fair question might be, how do we quantify that risk? And the person makes a wise statement that, if this was banking, this is like, you're heading into monopolistic territory. So, Dave, I don't know if you want to, it's very much a philosophical question, but how should we be thinking about all our data as it more and more does head to a few very, very large players?
Yeah, I think honestly, depending on the industry and the regulatory picture, there may be different approaches to this. This, I think, ties back into the hybrid cloud, where in some cases, some of those workloads you may decide to keep in your own data center to keep your thumb on it. If you have that level of sophistication, of course, the challenge there is you need to compete with the level of upkeep where these companies spending tens of billions of dollars on their infrastructure is keeping it up. So I guess, what's the real concern? Is the real concern data loss? There's obviously answers to that, a plethora of backup issues. Is the question some sort of privacy thing where there's a lack of trust of the vendor that somehow they're going to do something with your data? Well, that comes into their service level agreements. And again, the competitive landscape. If we were talking about one cloud vendor, I think that would be a lot different. But imagine if Microsoft ever had an issue where they were doing something inappropriate with your data. AWS would eat them alive, right? And it would be a tough row to hoe for Microsoft. So again, I don't know all of the ins and outs of that, but I think there's certainly ways to address each of those issues. Manage it yourself, make sure it's backed up. Honestly, I don't lose any sleep over wondering if Microsoft or AWS is going to do something bad with my data.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to go to what I believe today will be our final question, but if there's something still that you really want answered, please feel free to put it in the Q&A window. Bill, I'd like to ask you this one. You've mentioned that you're a smaller firm, and so we talked a lot today about compliance and security and some of those things that can really get in the weeds a little bit. So for both of you, but I'll go to Bill first. Do you work with solution architects when you're dealing with compliance and security? Or do you go out of house, and would you hire a third-party security firm to help with that?
Well, we have our own, and their solutions, AWS solutions architect, but they're trained in security, and we have a tool set that we use to do security assessments, cloud security assessments, documentation, recommendations. It is a different skill set than your traditional AWS, say, senior architect, and there's different training requirements. But if the question is more about if you're an enterprise and you're looking to do a security audit or a pen test, I would always recommend, looking at, an outsourced solution with an expert that focuses in that area, not just someone that says, yeah, we do security too, and we know how to secure this environment. I would, again, vet those service providers out carefully. What's the background? What's their experience? So
tremendous. Dave, how about at Ascendle? You work with other security and compliance consultants, or how would you handle it?
Yeah, we do both actually. So we're focused more on the software code itself and making sure that the security standards are met within the code. As far as the deployment environments, typically our customers are deploying into production. They would typically be in charge of the actual production environment. So as far as configuring the environments and making sure those are secure, that's their responsibility. Our responsibility is in the code. So we use security tooling similar to Bill. Our architects are trained in security, and then we also would leverage outside companies depending on the type of compliance requirements that we need. So for example, hiring a company to do a security audit or a pen test, which is focused on the code. And then our clients would typically do that as well when they're focused on the actual deployment environments themselves.
Got it. Hey, I really need to thank both these panelists today and our audience. It was a big crowd, and these questions were absolutely tremendous. So thank you for your time. It appears that we got through the bulk of those questions. If by chance I missed you, we will reach out to you directly with an answer. We're really grateful for your feedback. I want to thank everyone today for attending this webinar and participating with these questions. They were outstanding. You will receive an email with a link to today's recording and the slide deck. Thank you to Dave and Bill for sharing your knowledge and expertise with every one of us today. Bill, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. I had a blast. It was fun. And I learned some things too.
That's always a goal. Dave, thank you for your time today.
Absolutely. It's absolutely my pleasure, Bill. Thanks for being our guest expert. I also learned some stuff as well. And thank you for taking the time out of your day again. And thanks, Marcus, for doing a great job keeping us moving along.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.